For each policy instrument, we've done an identity card. One day all this will be on the web. For each policy instrument, we try to say where it's coming from, why was it introduced, for which policy, was it a new policy instrument, was it imported from another sector, from another level, why, what were the reasons to use it, who are the actors involved, could we identify conflict of controversy, what were the technique being used, what were the consequences, anyway, what was the carrier over time, how they would change over time. We try to be very precise. So to give you just one example of these lovely tables we're spending our life doing these days, this is called the authorization procedure for dangerous activities. It's part of the environment policy. Basically, when you create a new nuclear station in front of a lovely beach, you need some authorization from the Ministry of Industry, okay? And that's, the classic instruments is the 1987 law, which is always referred as a new policy instrument. But of course, when you look at where it's coming from, and you go back a bit, you can see that it was, in fact, a decree in 1810, invented by Napoleon, okay? Which was not implemented for about 100 years, but was there, okay? So for many policy instruments, we try to see whether we can come back and see how we can reconcile that. And we look at the objective of instruments, the method, the obligation, the evaluation system, the effect, and we try to have a huge database of all these policy instruments, okay? It sounds good. At the moment, we're a bit desperate because we're not finished and we're late. And then we look over the recent developments of this authorization and how things have developed over time. Okay? The second thing we do is we use the typology. Remember the 5 categories, the old classic instruments and the new policy instruments, the 3 new categories. So we try to put all these policy instruments in the typology. So this is the example of the urban policy of the EU, if there is such a thing as an urban policy at the EU level. And you can see that we can show how lots of policy instruments were coming from a regional policy, where they were framed. Most of them were legislative and regulatory instruments, economic and fiscal, agreement-based, information, blah, 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 okay? And what we do, of course, is then having lovely tables where you try to map out whether this, the number. So it's a funny measure, really, okay? Because, of course, some are small policy instruments, some are big, okay? So we just measure the number in a very crude way, which tells you something, okay? But it's not a very sophisticated method. And you can see that, so blue is environment, red is urban, that at the EU level, but that's also true at the national level, in all the sectors we're using, we see that the old policy instruments are still there, most of them, and we see a combination of this old and new in all sorts of ways. It sounds very simple, but it just shows that most of the EU literature on environment policy is wrong. Because they concentrate on new policy instrument and they say everything changed because of new policy instrument, when most of the time these new policies are completely coordinated with some of the old ones, and the most important one in terms of effect are the old one. Okay? So we try to see how much innovation is going there and how much it tells us. Okay? So we do also where these policies are coming from. And we discovered, for instance, like in the environment policy, a lot of the policy instruments used at the EU level were, in fact, the import from discussion at the international level. There's a number of policy instruments in the environment field which had been invented and discussed in international forum, but not implemented, and then used and implemented at the EU level. So they are new in the sense that they were not used before, but in terms of conceptualization, they have been there before. They were in the cupboard. Okay? So it's interesting to understand why the EU used those policy instruments rather than the national ones existing in different countries. So you can start saying a few things about understanding the EU governance in that thing. Okay, we're doing things also over time to see if the number of instruments in each category has changed over time, and the results are not very spectacular. We can see that some of these new ones are a bit more used nowadays, but we don't see massive effect so far. So it's a much more gradual view. In a way, we are even reinforcing the classic neo-institutionalist view of things change progressively. Okay? And you have always new policy instruments, but it's a new layer on the cake. This image remains very strong for the policies, the two policies we are studying. So you may tell us, okay, so what? What does it tell us, all these things? I'll just give you 4 ideas of coming back from, reflecting from, that's my last slide, from what we have been doing. And I will not use them in the same way. Number 1, I will start by the last one, on innovation. I'm saying that the logic is very much not so rapid innovation, okay? But there are exceptions. And the urban policy in the UK is one of the most interesting exceptions in our research, which is not surprising. We know that the UK is the country which has been the most innovative in all sorts of ways to change the state and to develop all sorts of patterns and new modes of governance. This is the laboratory of Europe, as you know. It's a bit of a Dr. Faust laboratory. They tried all sorts of things. Some went completely wrong, some brilliant success, but it's quite fascinating. They do more innovation than anybody else. And you can see that in urban policy, where over 5 years we identified 73 new policy initiatives at some point in the urban policy. And it's interesting when you think about innovation, and it's coming also from the critical studies of management, why would you use systematic innovation? Why sometimes in public policy there's a systematic strategy to use innovation and new policy instruments in a very, very systematic way? And with the work I'm doing with my colleague Alan Scott, we're trying to argue that when you see some attempt to develop massive innovation in a systematic way, it is a very clever strategy to make behavior of individuals more predictable. By introducing new policy instruments all the time, number 1, critical scholars get quiet because they spend their time analyzing the new initiatives and so they don't do serious work anymore, which has happened to a lot of our colleagues doing that, and that happens in France all the time as well. But more seriously, it happens that people get used to jump on the new initiatives which have a bit of money. So in a way, you could see that the individuals and the organizations, they learn that they have to be quick to jump on the new initiatives because there's not so much money, and if you don't get the money quickly, then it will be gone. And after 4, 5, 6, 7 years, it's quite fascinating to see in very policy sectors how people and organizations learn to adapt to constant innovation. And they adapt and they change all the time. And of course, from the point of view of governing, this is wonderful. Because you manage to make the behavior of people predictable. When they get used to that, of course sometimes they cheat and you don't know that, but you realize that they will jump on the new initiative. So there's a very strong power dimension in systematic innovation. And I see I've got some colleagues from the UK here, and they know the research assessment exercise. Some of you may know the ranking system for research centers. If you change the rules of the game every 3 or 4 years, then people get used to it, and they adapt to the new rules of the game all the time. This is wonderful, and the government pushes the button, and 4 years later, it has the illusion that people have changed their behavior to follow the new rules. And you could see that in hospitals, you could see that you have system of innovations are very similar in different policy sectors in the UK. So, first thing I wanted to emphasize, that's just to discuss with Jan Peter, there's a very strong also power dimension to govern by using systematic innovations. And it's very well known in public management. By introducing systematic innovations, you may destabilize existing arrangement, create a climate of uncertainty, which is destabilizing for individuals, and make their behavior predictable, up to a point, because after a while they know how to cheat, and these things are meaningless. That's the first thing. The second thing, in a different conclusion I want to emphasize, is, in a way, instrumentation is quite important to understand the developments of a policy.